Hello and welcome to a new masterclass within the Master's degree in Military History of INISEC. My name is Juan Alarcón. I teach China and Taiwan relations at INISEC, and I'm your host, as always. Today's masterclass is about commemoration. As you may already know, the year 2025 marks the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, and INISEC is an active player in the commemorative events as it is an official partner of the Vietnam War Commemoration Partner Program 2025. So, commemorating the Vietnam War, Origins, Objectives, and Perspectives, that is the title of today's lecture, and our distinguished speaker is U.S. Army retired Colonel Mark Franklin. But before welcoming our guest, we'll begin, as always, with a brief introduction to our topic by Professor David Akashar, who is director of the Master's degree in Military History. David, how are you doing? ¿Cómo estás?
Muy bien, Juanjo, muchas gracias. Preparado para una nueva masterclass.
Okay, nice. So you can go ahead with your presentation.
Muchas gracias. Bien, de nuevo, como presentaba el profesor Juanjo Alarcón, estamos en esta nueva masterclass con el profesor del coronel retirado Mark Franklin, la conmemoración de la Guerra de Vietnam. Y el título de esta masterclass, 1965, y la conmemoración del conflicto del final de la Guerra de Vietnam. Los orígenes de la Guerra de Vietnam se sitúan, nos podemos ubicar después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, ese sentimiento antiimperialista que se extendía por las colonias europeas hasta llegar hasta la región de Indochina, entonces controlada por Francia. Recordemos que esas hostilidades entre las tropas coloniales y el Viet Minh, la guerrilla independentista liderada por Ho Chi Minh, dieron lugar a la Guerra de Indochina entre 1946 y 1954. El conflicto terminó con la firma de los Acuerdos de Ginebra, que llevaron a decretar la independencia de las colonias de Indochina y la partición de Vietnam en dos estados. El norte estaría controlado por los comunistas, mientras que el sur estaría vinculado, en este caso, a Occidente. Asimismo, los pactos establecerían la celebración de un referéndum para decidir la unificación o fragmentación definitiva del territorio de Vietnam. El miedo de Estados Unidos a un Vietnam unificado bajo el comunismo impidió la consulta. En plena Guerra Fría, la administración de Dwight D. Eisenhower temía un efecto dominó en la región. Para evitarlo, Washington envió la asistencia económica y militar a Vietnam del Sur. La negativa del Estado subvietnamita a celebrar el referéndum exacerbó los ánimos del Frente Nacional de Liberación de Vietnam, conocido como el Vietcong. La nueva milicia de Ho Chi Minh comenzaba a operar para derrocar al gobierno de Ngo Dien Bien. Esta escasa preparación del ejército subvietnamita favorecía la incursión de la guerrilla. A ello se sumaba la inestabilidad de la autocracia nepotista que había instaurado Diem. El descontento de la mayoría budista contra el presidente católico llevó a Estados Unidos a apoyar un golpe de Estado en 1963, durante el mandato de John Fitzgerald Kennedy hasta su asesinato. Los estadounidenses, recordemos, habían incrementado esa presencia en el sur de Vietnam. Sin embargo, el curso de la guerra era desfavorable para los intereses, más aún con la entrada del ejército de Vietnam del Norte en el verano de 1964. Ante la caída inminente de la capital, Saigón, el sucesor de Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, decidió intervenir en el conflicto. El casus belli se produjo el 4 de agosto en el Golfo de Tonkin. Según la versión estadounidense, varias lanchas patrulleras de Vietnam del Norte habían atacado dos destructores de Estados Unidos cuando estos se adentraron en aguas de los comunistas reivindicaban como propias. Pese a que nunca hubo evidencias del ataque, Johnson lo utilizó como pretexto para solicitar al Congreso una intervención directa de Estados Unidos en la Guerra de Vietnam. Tras el triunfo de las elecciones del 64, Johnson autorizó la operación Rolling Thunder, que iniciaría su despliegue militar. Las primeras tropas desembarcaron en la base de Da Nang 6 días después, el 8 de marzo de 1965. 3.500 soldados se unían a los ya 60.000 asesores militares de Estados Unidos en el territorio de Vietnam. Durante su mandato, Johnson aumentó la presencia militar en territorio vietnamita, hasta alcanzar los 536.000 efectivos en 1968. Sin embargo, la inexperiencia de las jóvenes tropas estadounidenses, su desconocimiento del terreno y el apoyo de China y de la Unión Soviética al Vietcong hicieron fracasar la intervención. La participación de Estados Unidos en Vietnam fue controversial entre su población. Los bombardeos televisados y las 58.000 bajas del ejército estadounidense generaron un gran rechazo social con las pequeñas protestas estudiantiles de 1965 que, extendidas entre los sectores izquierdistas, pacifistas y hippies de todo el país, y con ello finalizó, en este caso, mi pequeña introducción histórica a la masterclass de hoy sobre la intervención norteamericana en la Guerra de Vietnam, acuciando evidentemente esa conmemoración del 50 aniversario de la participación de Estados Unidos en el conflicto del sudeste asiático. Juanjo, cuando quieras, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, David, for your analysis. Nobody does it better, except our guest, of course. And now it's time to welcome him. Colonel, retired Colonel Mark Franklin. How are you doing, sir?
Doing very well. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, it's a pleasure for us. Colonel, before giving you the floor, let me read your amazing resume. Is that okay with you?
Yes, please. Thank you. Hopefully
Okay.
it's
You're welcome. So, retired Colonel Mark Franklin was commissioned as second lieutenant infantry officer in 1980. He was assigned to the 9th Infantry Division, Fort Lewis, Washington, where he served as a weapons platoon leader, light attack vehicle platoon leader, and finally as Battalion S4. After 2 company command tours, he joined the Army's Foreign Area Officer training program, during which he earned an MA in East Asian Languages and Cultures from Indiana University and attended the Korean Basic Language course at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California. His training culminated with his attendance at the Republic of Korea Army Staff College in Chiegu. Then he was assigned as the executive assistant to the Deputy Commander, South Korea U.S. Combined Forces Command. He served in the Joint Staff J2 Intelligence during the 9/11 attack on the Pentagon in 2001. After that, he served in the China Policy Officer, Defense Prisoner of War, Missing Personnel Office, and in 2004, he led a team into North Korea on a 10-day oversight mission to monitor the recovery efforts of missing Korean War veterans. In 2008, he deployed to Pakistan in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, serving as the U.S. Army Liaison Officer to the Pakistan Army and Chief of Staff for the Office Defense Representative Pakistan. His last assignment was to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Asia, and Pacific Security Affairs as the Senior Country Director for China, responsible for developing U.S. policy for the military-to-military relationship with China. He retired from the Army on January 2012 after 30 years of service. He currently leads the History and Legacy branch for the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War commemoration, providing the public with a clear understanding and appreciation of the service and sacrifice of Vietnam War veterans. Well, wow, impressive indeed. I'm speechless, but fortunately the speech is not, I'm not giving the speech, it's our Colonel. So without further ado, Colonel Franklin, you have the floor. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you very, very much for having me. And so this evening, what I'd like to do is talk to you about this national effort to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War and provide a thank you. We're turning back a page in history to right a wrong and provide a thank you to our Vietnam veterans and their families for their service and sacrifice. So why do we commemorate? If you look at the top, you have the World War II monument in Washington, D.C. In the top right is the Korean War. Down below is the Pentagon 9/11 Memorial, and then off to the left in the lower left is the Vietnam War Memorial. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines the act of commemorating as a call to remember, to mark some ceremony or observation, to serve as a memorial. And when we commemorate our past conflicts, whether it be the Civil War or World War II or the Korean War, there's an essential element to that commemoration that recognizes the service, valor, and sacrifice of our nation's veterans. Commemorating past wars serves to remind us who we are as a nation, what we stand for, and ultimately what we have lost. When we commemorate to remember. The Department of Defense has commemorated the past conflicts, as I mentioned, Civil War, World War II, Korea War. And so commemorating the Vietnam War follows that tradition. But our involvement in Vietnam lasted 20 years. It was a long war when you consider our support for the French and then the advisors we had in country. And it spanned 6 presidents, from President Truman to President Ford. And as our involvement expanded, so did American opposition to the war. The Vietnam War was a very controversial war. It had a large anti-war movement and protests. And unfortunately, unlike past wars, where our veterans were often celebrated and congratulated when they came home, many Americans couldn't make a distinction between the warrior and the war. And they took their anger out on the troops coming home from Vietnam. Now, we learned quite a few lessons from the Vietnam War, but probably the most important lesson is that we should never blame the warrior for the war. And so from its very beginning, the United States of America Vietnam War commemoration has held to the principle that this commemoration was about the service and sacrifice of our Vietnam War veterans and their families. We made no official judgment about the rightness, the wrongness, for or against the Vietnam War. So how did we get started? In Congress, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2008 authorized the Department of Defense to put together a program to assist a grateful nation in thanking and honoring our Vietnam veterans and their families. This went into public law, as you can see below on the slide. And I need your help. If any of these slides don't advance, just yell at me and let me know. But Congress also gave us 5 objectives. First and foremost is to thank and honor the Vietnam War, including those personnel who were held as prisoners of war, those who are still unaccounted for and listed as missing in action, and their families for their service and sacrifice on behalf of the United States. We also want to highlight the service of the armed forces and other federal agencies that contributed to that effort and pay tribute to the home front. Now, I mentioned earlier that Vietnam was a controversial war, and there was a large anti-war movement going on in the States as the war progressed. But for every troop downrange in Vietnam, there was a family back home praying for that person, hoping they would return home safely. We also want to highlight advances in technology, science, and medicine. Things that we take for granted today had their origins in the Vietnam War, particularly medical advances in surgery and anesthesia and how we treat diseases. And finally, we want to recognize the contributions and sacrifices made by the allies, the United States, during the Vietnam War, particularly those who provided the combat forces from Republic of Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines. Now, I want to point out that while Spain didn't provide combat troops, at the request of the South Vietnamese government, it did send a medical mission of 13 personnel to include 4 doctors, a quartermaster, a captain in charge, and 7 nurses. And they all arrived in September of 1966. So what are some of the ways that we are doing this recognition for our Vietnam veterans? We followed a tradition from World War II. When the troops came home from World War II, they were given what was called a victory pin. It was a little lapel pin that was a circle with a bird flying through it, and the troops from World War II affectionately called it the ruptured duck. Well, we have done something very, very similar by devising a Vietnam veteran lapel pin. And so if you served in the U.S. military between November 1st, 1955 and May 15th, 1975, regardless of where you served, you did not have to serve in country or in theater, you were awarded this Vietnam veteran lapel pin. On the front face, you see the blue outline circle with the words Vietnam War veteran and the laurel wreaths on either side, the American eagle in the center, and those 6 stars represent the United States and the 5 allies that I mentioned earlier, Republic of Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines. But probably the most important thing is the message on the back where it says, a grateful nation thanks and honors you. Now, this is a very, very modest way of recognizing our Vietnam veterans, but I can tell you quite often the emotional response we get from the veterans when we present it is quite compelling. We also recognize special categories of both veterans and family members with our certificates of honor. Beginning at the top, we have a lapel pin for those who were formerly held for our former prisoners of war, Vietnam veterans. Right below it, we have a lapel pin for family members who are still waiting for a full accounting of their loved one who has gone missing in action. Most of our missing are now presumed dead, but we still make efforts in Vietnam to recover their remains. Below that, you see the Gold Star lapel pin. That is presented to our Gold Star family members. A Gold Star family member is one who has lost a family member in combat in war. So for those who have lost, most of them now are daughters and sons, because most Gold Star moms have passed on, and there are some still Gold Star wives as well. And then finally, the blue star at the bottom, that's our in memory of. So if a Vietnam veteran came back home, survived, went on with his life, and then passed away, his or her surviving spouse would be awarded this Gold Star lapel pin. In 2017, President Trump signed into law the Vietnam War Veterans Recognition Act, making every March 29th National Vietnam War Veterans Day. This day will remain in perpetuity So every March 29th, we will have a ceremony at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial at the Wall. And this is our way of making sure that our Vietnam veterans continue to be recognized in perpetuity. And this national holiday, it joins other military holidays such as our Armed Forces Day, Memorial Day, and Veterans Day. In Memorial Day 2012, this is when we announced to the nation that we were going to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War. You can see President Obama was our keynote speaker. If you remember, most of you probably too young, but there was a TV program called Magnum PI, and the actor on that was Tom Selleck. Well, Tom Selleck was our master of ceremonies. And then those officers you see at the bottom represent the service chiefs. Each one of them escorted a Gold Star family member to present a wreath at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. This was our way of this was really our inaugural event to announce to the nation. But I want to play for you now a segment from President Obama's speech that really captures what we hope to have achieved with this 13-year commemoration project. And please let me know if it doesn't play well so I can see if I can figure it out.
And one of the most painful chapters in our history was Vietnam. Most particularly how we treated our troops who served there. You are often blamed for a war you didn't start, and you should have been commended for serving your country with valor. You're sometimes blamed for misdeeds of a few. And the honorable service of the many should have been praised. You came home and sometimes were denigrated when you should have been celebrated. It was a national shame, a disgrace. It should have never happened. That's why here today we resolve that it will not happen again.
So in the beginning, it didn't go so well for us. We had a lot of criticism for a lot of different reasons. One of the first criticisms is that we were trying to rewrite the history of the Vietnam War, present a false narrative about the war. And this is some of the limits and some of the risks that you have with any commemoration effort, particularly when you're commemorating past conflicts. And so the anti-war crowd that was very active during the war began to raise its voices once again, and was very, very critical of our effort to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War. Another thing that happened is a fellow by the name of Nick Turse wrote a book that is called Kill Anything That Moves, The Real American War in Vietnam. Now, we acknowledge that there were atrocities. We did commit atrocities during the war. The most infamous was the massacre at My Lai, the village of My Lai, where American troops massacred a village of civilians, women and children in 1968. And that did happen. But this book, Kill Anything That Moves, asserts that these atrocities were not aberrations, that they were everyday events. And he goes on to say in his book that they were actually command-driven, that we were looking for a high body count, and a dead civilian was as good as a dead Viet Cong or a dead North Vietnamese. Of course, that was absolutely ridiculous. But this book, when it came out, it got a lot of attention. And so that was followed by a couple of articles. The Tom Dispatch, you can see the title here, The Pentagon Makes History, the First Casualty. We got a petition submitted to my director from the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee, demanding that we give the anti-war movement an equal voice in this commemoration, that we remove the timeline on our website because it provided a false narrative of the war. And then other articles would appear in the New York Times and Washington Post, very critical of our effort. So two things happened. The first thing is I invited this Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee to join me at Fort Myer in Washington, D.C., to sit down and talk about the commemoration and what we were actually trying to achieve. And it was a successful meeting. They walked away understanding that our primary purpose was not to make a judgment about the war or to prepare or to rewrite the history, but to in fact thank and honor and recognize the Vietnam veterans for their service and sacrifice and doing what their country called them to do. The other thing that happened is that an article appeared in the East Asian History and Culture Review by two historians. Gary Kulik, you see down there, is a historian. He was a medic in Vietnam. He was a conscientious objector. He did not want to carry a weapon, didn't want to shoot anybody, but he served, and he served as a medic. And the other historian who wrote this article was Dr. Pete Zinnemann, who is a Vietnam history professor from the University of California, Berkeley, which was the birthplace, oddly, of the anti-war movement. So they write a 32-page article that essentially eviscerates Nick Turse's book, Kill Anything That Moves. It discredits him for his lack of scholarship, his lack of sources. And after this article came out, and word spread a little bit, and after my meeting with the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee, the anti-war critiques of our commemoration pretty much went quiet. And that was a good day for me. So we are, at our peak, we were a staff of about 40 people, and there are approximately 6 million Vietnam War veterans across the country and abroad. We knew we couldn't get to all of them. So we followed the templates of World War II and the Korean War, and we created the Commemorative Partner Program, of which INSIG is a member. They're part of the Commemorative Partner Program. And what we ask our commemorative partners to do is in some way recognize our Vietnam veterans a couple of times a year, and in return, we send them a Commemorative Partner kit and provide them material support and speaker support for any events that they might be able to accommodate. So now we have more than 13,000 across the country. So this program has achieved two things. First, it provided us a lot of help across the country to recognize and thank our Vietnam War veterans. And you can see some of the Commemorative Partner logos up here. But the other thing it did is it got the country invested in this effort to recognize and finally turn back a page in history and thank and give our Vietnam veterans a thank you they didn't get 50 years ago when they came home, regardless of how you felt about the war. So this kind of woke the country up to the fact that we owed this thank you to our Vietnam veterans. They got personally involved, and the program itself has been incredibly successful. So here's some of the things we've been able to accomplish in our commemoration period. So I mentioned before, we estimate there's between 6 and 7 million United States Vietnam veterans, both here and abroad in America, who served on active duty during the period that I described earlier. We are losing our Vietnam veterans at a rate of about 600 a day. About 600 Vietnam veterans are dying per day. So we're kind of in a hurry to get as many as we can. So far to date, we have conducted more, with the help of our commemorative partners, we've conducted more than 26,000 ceremonies across the country to recognize our Vietnam veterans. Some of them are hard to get to, and some of them, quite frankly, don't want to be recognized. It was a bad period in their life. They want to forget about it, and they really, it's rare, but you will find Vietnam veterans that will refuse the lapel pin and don't want anything to do with the commemoration, and that's the way they feel about it. But the other thing we want to do is encourage Americans to learn more about the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, better to appreciate their service of our veterans, and also to ensure the legacy of that service and sacrifice endures. And that's where my branch comes in. The History and Legacy branch is set out to do just that. And how do we do it? Well, we started with creating 27 topics of educational posters that I make free of charge to middle schools and high schools. Up until May of this year, I would ship these to any middle school, high school, public library, museum, college, university that requested them. And they cover a variety of topics. They're kind of wave top in approach in that they don't get into a lot of detail. You see the one on the left, the POW experience in the Vietnam War. The poster panels are 24 by 36 inches, so they're large. That's a 4-panel poster. And the idea is to provide just enough information for a student to want to learn more and do their own research about that particular topic. In the middle is an example we have of medical advancements in the Vietnam War. It talks about advances in surgery and anesthesia. If you remember, one of our objectives is to recognize the contributions of our allies. And so we have an educational poster on the Ally experience in Vietnam. It's a 5-panel poster. So that's one way that we're hoping to encourage Americans to learn more. The other way is that I created an oral history program. And so we now have more than 875 video recorded oral histories of Vietnam veterans and Gold Star family members. I'd like to call out this book by Samuel Hines. He's a World War II veteran, later historian, and he wrote a book called The Soldier's Tale. And in that book, he says, as you can read, the myth of war tells what is imaginable and manageable. That's the myth of war. The soldier's tale and its infinite variety tells the whole story. So while oral histories might not present a perfect history of the event, when you put them all together, they tend to show trends and create a fabric of the history of the war. And so we have found a lot of trends through interviewing these veterans. I'll describe a couple. You see, General Shinseki was former Chief of Staff of the Army and Secretary for Veterans Affairs later on. He's on the left. Admiral Mullen was the chairman of our Joint Chiefs. Right below him is Vice Admiral Hull, who was the Coast Guard chief. Next to him is Ev Alvarez, Navy pilot, who was held as a POW for 8 years in the Hanoi Hilton. General Bodie, that pilot you see in the center, one of the few African-American fighter pilots in Vietnam. It was hard if you were an African-American to get in the fighter program. Racism had something to do with that, but he managed. We've got a few more that were in there. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the last two, Marine Corps Private First Class Jose Anzaldúa and Nurse Donna Rowe. And I took segments from their oral histories quotes, but we'll start with Donna Rowe. She wanted to be a nurse, and she knew that the Army would help pay for her nursing school. So but she was too young to volunteer. All the women in that went to Vietnam, and there are quite a few, but they all had to volunteer. They weren't drafted. So she had to get her dad to sign the paper. She didn't know anything about the Vietnam War. And it wasn't until her dad told her that, you know, if I sign this and you go and you become a nurse, you're going to war. 3 years later, she was there. Now, she talks about in her oral history about life in a field hospital and treating some of the most horrific wounds that you can imagine. Her story is on our website. And at the end of this presentation, I'll give you a link to our website where you can see some of these. The other one I want to talk about is Private First Class Marine Corps Jose Anzaldúa. So if you were a prisoner of war, chances are you were either an Air Force or Navy pilot. Most of our POWs in Vietnam were pilots in the Navy Air Force that were shot down, and they were held in prisons in North Vietnam. Usually the infamous Hanoi Hilton is what most people remember. However, if you were captured in South Vietnam, as PFC Anzaldúa was, you were captured by the Viet Cong or Viet Minh, and you would be marched through the jungles of South Vietnam for months before you would make your way up north. And this was to keep you away from Americans and other allies from rescuing you. Well, Private Anzaldúa had been wounded badly, shot in the arm and shot in his left foot. And the foot wound is the one that became infected. And it became worse and worse every day. So one day it was really bad, and he took his boot off just to get some relief from the pain. Well, when he did that, his boot swelled up and he couldn't get his boot back on. And so now he is marching through the jungle with a badly wounded foot. And it got to a point where one day he just could not get up. It was too painful. He just didn't have it within him to get up. A Viet Minh guard came up, put an AK-47 to his head and essentially said, you will walk or you will die. He starts singing the Marine Corps hymn, gets up, and he was able to make it until they got him to a prison of war camp on the Laos border. And eventually he did make it to the north. And he will tell you that the treatment for him was a lot better in the North Vietnam than it was being marched through the jungles of South Vietnam. But his oral history is also on our website, a very, very compelling story as well. Now, if you've ever been to the Pentagon, it's like a mini museum. There are exhibits everywhere, and we didn't want to be left out. So my team created an exhibit to the Vietnam War in the Pentagon. 320 linear feet on either side. It's in the inner quarter of the Pentagon on what we call the A-ring, overlooking the courtyard. And on one side is a timeline that starts with September 1945, Ho Chi Minh's Declaration of Independence. And it continues on with those significant events that occurred over the next 20 years. And ends in 1975 with the evacuation of Saigon under Operation Frequent Wind. You see those blue streamers? Each one of those white silhouettes represents 1,000 troops on the ground. So by 1967, we had more than 485,000 troops on the ground. And by 1968, we had more than 500,000 troops on the ground in Vietnam. Across from the timeline is a collection of artifacts corresponding to that period of war. And you see that first section there, we call the Road to War. That was our early involvement. And as you progress down, those artifacts kind of correspond to the timeline across the hall. The big attraction in our Pentagon exhibit are the two Huey helicopters. Vietnam's often referred to as the helicopter war. Helicopters had a primary and essential role, if you will, in Vietnam. And the UH-1 Iroquois, affectionately called the Huey, is really the iconic symbol of the Vietnam War. So you see in the first helicopter, that's a troop transport, affectionately called a slick, sitting in a rice paddy. If you look further down, you have a medevac helicopter. They would call that dust off, sitting in the red clay of the Central Highlands. And those medevac helicopters are responsible for saving thousands of lives. So the Huey really has become the iconic symbol of the Vietnam War. And we are the only exhibit in the Pentagon that you can see virtually from your home computer on the website. When I provide you that link, you'll be able to go. I was able to get permission from the security folks at the Pentagon. We took out all the door signs and the floor mats and the locations of security cameras when we built this. But you can, one of my requirements when we contracted for this was that the viewer had to be able to see every entry, every photograph, every artifact, and you can go in and you can actually take a photo, take a picture and keep it. Everything on our website is free and public domain. So whether it be the educational posters, the oral histories for download, it's all available, it's all in public domain. The other thing we did to help educate the public, one of the criticisms that I took is that I was trying to corrupt the young minds of our students about the Vietnam War. That literally was what they wanted to say. And they thought I was trying to write lesson plans for teachers to use in the classroom. And that simply wasn't true. I learned early on that teachers do their own lesson plans, but what they like is free stuff. So we created a teacher's toolkit, and this does several things. The first thing it does is it provides online resources that the teacher can use, pull into the classroom to help teach about the Vietnam War. The other thing it does is, if you remember, I said we created educational posters covering approximately 27 different topics. The teacher's toolkit also has question prompts that align with each of those posters so that the teacher can use that in conjunction with the posters if they wanted to use the posters in the classroom. And the third thing it does is that in our public school system, a high school graduation requirement includes a community service project, something that you do for the community. And so we encourage teachers to combine what we call service learning with a project that either honors, in some way honors or recognizes a veteran in their community. And I use the example of Westlake High School in Austin, Texas. The virtual Vietnam project, in their 11th grade junior year, in their advanced placement English class, students are assigned a name from the Vietnam Veteran Memorial. And they do research on that name. They try to find photographs. They look for family members. They try to interview family members. If they're lucky, they'll find a veteran who served with that name on the wall. And they build a web-based video tribute to that particular veteran. And they set it to music. It's really well done. Some of the music isn't stuff that I would listen to, but nevertheless, it's really well done. And it's a great tribute to those veterans. And so we use that as an example of a service learning project. What I want to do now, we tried this earlier. It's a little hard to hear the dialogue, so I want to explain it. I'm going to play for you a video that demonstrates a passing of the torch and the mutual respect veterans have for one another, regardless of the generation they come from. So you will see an older gentleman sitting at a counter in a diner with a cup of coffee. and you will recognize early on that he is a Vietnam veteran. And a young troop from today in uniform walks in, and he is offered free coffee, and a gentleman stands up on his way out and thanks him for his service. He sits down, and a little boy wants to have his picture taken with this soldier, and they say thank you. And then the little boy comes up to the man sitting at the counter and asks him, "Are you a hero too?" And the man says, "Look, I just did the best job I could, just served as best I could." The little boy asks for a picture as well, because he said, "That man says you're a hero." So they take a picture, the little boy and his mom leave. And then the next thing you hear is the young troop saying, "Thank you for your service." Shaking hands, and there's this recognition and mutual respect. So I'm going to play it for you. Hopefully the dialogue will come through, but if not, I think I've given you enough that you can get a gist of what we're trying to achieve here.
Just a cup of coffee, please.
Coming right up. How much the charge?
Thank you.
Here you go.
That's good.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you for your support.
Sure.
Sure.
Smile. My son would like to ask you a question. Are you a hero too? That man said you were.
I just served as best I could.
Can we see a picture?
Sure.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your support.
Get your refill.
So I want to offer you some quick statistics about our involvement in Vietnam. There are 58,281 names on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Over that 20-year period, that's the number that we lost in that war. Millions of Vietnamese were killed in that war as well. We still have more than 1,500 that are still unaccounted for and missing in action. We have recovery missions to this day in the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. That relationship has improved, by the way, for a number of reasons, but they have, since the 1990s, they have let us back into the country to begin recovering the remains from that war. 263 Vietnam veterans received the Medal of Honor. Most of those were posthumous reception, and there are 47 living recipients today. We didn't keep very, very good records on Purple Heart. You were awarded the Purple Heart if you were wounded in combat, and a little more than 350,000 Vietnam veterans were awarded the Purple Heart. We still have a lot to do, and a short time to do it. So our mission remains to get all the Americans to help us across the nation thank and honor Vietnam veterans for their service. We come to an end in September of next year. Our congressional authorization ends at the end of fiscal year 25. So from now through the spring, We are surging and doing as much as we can to get to as many Vietnam veterans as we can. But beginning in May of next year, we will no longer have the budget or the personnel. We're down to about 20 people now. We'll probably be half that by May of 2025. So that's when we start to close down our operation. And our last event will be National Vietnam War Veterans Day on March 29th, 2025. You know, Americans continue to grapple with the history of our involvement in Vietnam. And each generation will continue to interpret and then reinterpret the war, its meaning, the lessons, and how we should remember it. And while it's important to understand and appreciate the contested nature of any of the war's history and that it still matters, our goal will always be to thank and honor our veterans for their service and sacrifice, irrespective of the political decisions that required them to do so. So there was a Vietnam veteran by the name of Albert Nahas, class of '67 West Point. And in his retirement years, he went around to every state and took a photograph of Vietnam veteran memorial in every state, wrote a little history about it, and he put it in a book called Warriors Remembered. And in that book, he wrote a poem, and I took two lines from that poem that sums up what Colonel Nahas and other Vietnam veterans felt when they came home. But they had no expectations to do but what duty called us to do, and they asked for no reward except the nation's thanks. And that's what this commemoration has been about from its very, very beginning. A nation's thanks to our Vietnam veterans and their families for their service and sacrifice. So, gentlemen and audience, that concludes my presentation. I want to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to do this today. I promised you this is who I am. You can reach me at this email address if you have any questions about this later on. And that is our website. It's a .com website, so it's easy to get to. You won't be told no. And that's where you can get all the information that I talked about earlier. And so with that, sir, I'm ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Colonel Mark Franklin, for such a beautiful, wonderful lecture. Normally, I describe our masterclass with the adjective terrific, etc. But I think your presentation is beautiful, wonderful, very emotive. So congratulations. We have truly enjoyed it. Thank you very much, sir.
Absolutely.
And now, well, as you said, it's time for questions and answers. We have 3 questions pre-written by our students. And I think David wants to add one more, maybe, right? So let's start with the first one. Oh, it doesn't matter. Okay, perfect. So each generation of Americans is still reinterpreting the meaning and lessons of the war and how it should be remembered. Do you think that the project commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War can have tangible results in changing the minds of the American haters from the US itself?
Yes, and I think we've done that. And I think in many ways we have helped achieve that. You know, historians will tell you that it really takes 50 years before you can do an objective understanding and analysis of any conflict. You know, when the Vietnam War ended, the history that came out of that war was very, very anti-war, and it elicited and there were problems with it. It was politically driven. There are a lot of issues. We learned a lot of lessons from Vietnam. As time went on, with the establishment of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in 1982, that trend in writing the history of the Vietnam War kind of morphed a little bit into making it the war was justified, legal, moral, was the right thing to do, was just prosecuted badly. We are now at 50 years. And if you read what's going on with the historiography of the Vietnam War, they're taking a more dispassionate, objective look at how that war came about and what we did. But more importantly, the lessons that we have learned from that war is that, one, if you make the political decision to go to war, that's one thing. But when it comes time to prosecute that war, rely on your military to do what they have been trained to do. With Vietnam, you had President Johnson picking targets. You had the President of the United States picking targets and actually telling the North Vietnamese when we were coming to attack certain places in North Vietnam. That's probably not a smart thing to do if you want to win the war. We also went into that war without knowing the culture or the history of Vietnam. That's why programs like the Foreign Area Officer Program, which teaches our officers to become specialists in a particular region, are so important, because you learn the language, the culture, the history of that region. We didn't have much of that going into Vietnam, and we treated Vietnam like we did World War II. And so in many ways, I think the Marine Corps had the better way. They went in there trying to be advisors and trying to learn that. We didn't pay much attention, but we have since learned that lesson. So a long-winded way of answering that question, but yes, I think we can continue to learn from that experience. I think we have learned quite a lot from that experience. For our purposes in the Vietnam War commemoration, the most important thing we've learned is that you don't blame the warrior for the war. Veterans, men and women, sign up because their country calls them to do so. It's not their decision, but they honor their country's call and they do what they think is required of them. And we should respect them for doing it.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. I have a question for you.
Yes.
It's about this this aspect of the questions talk about haters, American haters inside the United States, anti-war people. There is one, I read his books about the Vietnam War, is Noam Chomsky. Do you think, for example, Noam Chomsky now is different? He has changed his mind, or he is like every time anti-war, anti-American, etc.?
He has not changed.
This guy has changed?
No, I do not. I think he's very set in his views, and I'm familiar with Dr. Chomsky's work, and he makes some legitimate points. I think like what happens after every war, a lot of times history is written from emotion and not as dispassionately as it should be. And I think he was too close to a time when that was a very controversial war, and a lot of people were in many ways rightly upset about the way we went about that war. And I don't think he's going to lose that emotional attachment he has. I don't think it's changed. And we can debate the justification, the rationalization of going to Vietnam. What we shouldn't debate is how we treated our soldiers when they came, Marines, airmen, when they came home.
Okay, you are right. And by the way, Noam Chomsky is a fantastic intellectual.
Yes.
There's no problem about that. But I remember reading his books, and he was very vocal against the war.
Yes.
But it's right. He never. I also reckon he never criticized the soldiers. So in this aspect, he wasn't wrong.
We are in agreement. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So second question, sir. In 1965, Washington sent its first troops and entered fully into the conflict, confident that its overwhelming military superiority would bring it a quick victory. What do you think, sir, were the strategic or tactical mistakes that led to the war being lost by the US and South Vietnam?
So it's interesting, when you talk to veterans, you get a couple answers. They'll tell you we never lost a battle, and we didn't. We lost the war. We never lost the battle. And they will also tell you that, hey, we were winning when I left, so somebody else kind of blew it. We went into that war with a World War II mindset, and it was anything but. It was it was an insurgency war. It was a guerrilla warfare. I mean, you don't take armored vehicles like tanks into the jungle. They're ineffective. So the first problem we did was we prosecuted that war with a World War II mindset, something that we learned very, very well after. We also went into that war without an end state, without an exit plan. What objectives do you want to achieve? We didn't have clear defined objectives. We didn't have an exit plan. We thought, as you said, our overwhelming military might will bring a quick end. Well, that didn't happen. And so we had to continue to send more troops and more troops and more troops. And we did so without a cultural understanding, historical understanding. The Vietnamese have been fighting the Chinese for 1,000 years very effectively. They're very, very good at it. And any troop, any Vietnam veteran that had direct contact with the North Vietnamese army will tell you they respected them. They were good soldiers, good fighters. And so they knew what they were doing, and they were committed. They were absolutely committed to winning. We got tired of getting beat up, and we got tired of the casualties. And after 20 years, we got tired. It was a war of attrition, and we gave up. The North Vietnamese were never going to give up. So they were far more committed. We went into it with the wrong mindset. We went into it with an antiquated, old-fashioned kind of military mindset. If there's any good to come out of it, it was General Colin Powell. It's called the Powell Doctrine, and he will tell you that it's not his doctrine, but the young leaders that were in Vietnam that later became our senior leaders in the military learned those lessons and knew from the beginning that if we go into any war, we're going to go in with international support, we're going to go in with public support, we're going to have clearly defined objectives, and we will have an exit strategy. What do you want to accomplish, and how are you going to get out when you're done? We didn't learn that very well in Afghanistan. That's another topic for another time. But we did learn it for the Iraq operation, Desert Shield, Desert Storm. So that is why we lost the war. We won every battle, but we lost the war.
Okay, thank you very much. By the way, I teach a subject on first Indochina War, the
Yes.
French War,
Yeah.
at INISEC. And my idea is, I want to put this question to you. Do you think the US learned something from the defeat of the French? I think no, because if I was I never go to Vietnam, first of all. Because I think since the defeat of the French, it was impossible that nobody could win to the North Vietnamese. They were very, very focused.
Yeah, unless you're an American with a big ego and you think that you can defeat anybody because of how successful you were in World War II. We did a couple of things. So we were supporting the French in their desire to get back their colonial kind of entitlements in Indochina, and that was a mistake. I mean, had Roosevelt lived, we may have gone into that a little bit differently. But he died. Truman became president. Truman did buy into the domino theory and the fall of communist dominoes in Southeast Asia and Indochina, and he felt strongly about it, as did Eisenhower and to some degree President Kennedy. So what happened was we redirected our focus, and that's when we transitioned from our military assistance advisory group Indochina, which included Laos and Cambodia, and focused primarily on Vietnam to keep that from falling into communist hands. So I think we thought, one, we're the United States, so yes, we're going to win this. It's the French, they can't win, we can't. So it was hubris and a little bit of, well, not a little bit, but it was a matter of hubris and thinking we were a little bit better than we actually were, and not understanding what we were getting into, and also firmly committed to the belief that we can't let another communist domino fall. We saw what happened in Korea. We saw what happened in China. We were committed to prevent that from happening in Southeast Asia. So did we learn any lessons from the French? No. I think hubris and our own kind of ego got in the way, and we assumed that we could do better and that we would win. I'm losing your audio, Juanjo.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry. Last question from our students. President Richard Nixon's withdrawal order was decisive, as the weak peace process that followed it paved the way for the North Vietnamese victory 2 years later. If Nixon's administration had maintained and changed its support, its commitment for South Vietnam with more troops and war material and equipment, could the war have been won or prolonged? What do you think?
That is one of the best questions that still exists today. So President Nixon ran on a platform of getting out of Vietnam and turning the war over to the Vietnamese military. And it was called his Vietnamization. He wanted us to do more to train them better, equip them better so that they could stand on their own. And I think the thought was what you would have in Korea at the 17th parallel, similar to what you have in Korea. What you have in Vietnam, the 17th parallel, you would have in Korea at the 38th parallel. And so you would have a divided Vietnam. But a little thing called Watergate got in the way, and President Nixon had to resign. And when he resigned, the Nixon peace, the peace treaty that came out of that is that the North Vietnamese promised not to come south, and we promised to withdraw, but we would continue to supply South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, with military material support. So weapons, ammunition, spare parts, maintenance, that kind of thing. We would continue to support them, and the North Vietnamese would stay above the 17th parallel. Neither one happened. What happened was Nixon resigns, Ford becomes president. Politically now he's very weak because he has just taken over from a president that was impeached and had to resign. Congress had the majority in Congress was very, very anti-war at the time. So two things happened. Congress basically reneged on our part of the agreement and cut off all material support to South Vietnam. So all the weapons, the ammunition that we promised South Vietnam to basically resist any North Vietnamese aggression, that came to a halt. And as we know, the North Vietnamese didn't honor their part either. They came well south of the 17th parallel, and in a very, very quick matter of time, were able to reach Saigon and essentially invade and take over South Vietnam. Had Nixon remained president, we can speculate. I'm of the opinion that had he remained president, not resigned, he would have held Congress and told them to hold up our end of the bargain. And who knows? By that time, much of the South Vietnamese military was a lot better at what they were supposed to do than when we first got there. And it was their country, so who knows what could have happened. It's a good question, and it is still debated today. I guess we'll never know.
Okay, thank you, sir. Now is, I think David has a question for you. David, go ahead. Something happened with the connection from David.
Oh, yeah, he's frozen.
He's frozen. The image, not him, I hope.
That usually happens to me. I'm usually the one that puts up and everything stops.
David? Wow. Let me contact him by WhatsApp, something like that.
Okay.
Right now, live.
That's technology today, yeah.
Okay. David, what are you doing? Okay, he went out. He's gonna reconnect.
Come back
right
in.
now. Sorry to our viewers for this inconvenience, but it's a little problem. Well, talking about the last question, I think prolongs the war. It didn't make sense. It's more casualties in each camp, so prolongs the war.
It could have prolonged the war. You might have had a situation like what you have in Korea today.
I'm not sure. It's a speculation.
Yeah, all speculation. I know that when the North invaded, there are Vietnamese Americans here today that came over as refugees, where many of the men who served in the military were put into labor camps when the North Vietnamese took over. Yeah. So the treatment of the South Vietnamese after that war ended was not a good one by the North Vietnamese. I mean, they were treated.
No, they did the same to the French.
Yes.
There are still in Vietnam. There are still, I think, 15,000 corpses of.
Oh my goodness.
French people and Algerian people, soldiers from the French military that haven't been recovered yet.
But
I think the number is 15,000.
Yeah, I don't know that they have that. We've got more than 1,500, but 15,000, that's 10 times what we have. That's quite a few.
Those people were killed not in the battlefield, but in the prisoners' camps.
Ah, okay, taken prisoners. Yeah.
And the march, you know, the march, they
Yes.
make the
Yes.
march, very long march, 600 kilometers. A lot of people died during the
This
march.
is after in 54 after Dien Bien Phu. Yeah.
Yeah, after Dien Bien Phu, the people in Dien Bien Phu, because
Yes.
everybody says that the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. Well, yes, they were defeated, but there were more casualties from the Vietnamese than from the French.
Yes.
There were 8,000 survivors, French survivors from Dien Bien Phu. And these people, almost 90% died in the concentration camps or during the march to the concentration camps.
Yeah. Brutal time.
So the treatment was very awful.
Yeah.
But we know, and you know, that in Asia, life is nothing in Asia. Asian people treat his own people. They treat his own people like nothing. So imagine about Westerners or other people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a different perspective. I think sometimes.
Well, I don't know what happened with David.
What? Yeah. Did he give you his question in advance?
Sorry. No, I'm trying to connect with David. I don't know what happened. He's not still connected. He should have been reconnected already. Okay, well. Well, I think I have to finish the masterclass because David has a problem. He cannot reconnect again. So I will ask you one more question.
Sure.
One more question to finish our masterclass. Very interesting indeed, very beautiful, emotive. And it will be a question about here's David, about Korea, if you don't mind, about
Sure.
Korea.
Sorry.
Hey, David.
Sorry. The connection of internet.
Let me ask one more questions to our guest, and then you will have your opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Juanjo.
You know that there was a crisis during the Korean popes. There was a crisis with the Chinese popes. There was a rebellion, and some of them wanted to go to Taiwan. Do you know this story?
That I don't know. No.
In 54, after during the negotiations for the armistice, for the peace. Well, no, the peace, not for the armistice.
You're talking about the Korean War.
The Chinese prisoners of war in South Korea.
Yep.
Some of them were nationalists. So they didn't want to go back to China because already was a communist country.
Right.
So they wanted to go to Taiwan. And they also convinced a lot of supposedly communist soldiers to back them and go and ask for going to Taiwan too. Did you know this story about?
I did not.
Oh, I thought you were because you were in Korea. Okay, well, it doesn't matter.
Well, what was the question?
So David, question.
Okay.
Now is the question from David. David, la teva pregunta.
Yes, moment, please. Yes, the question. Do you think that the support of China and the Soviet Union to North Vietnam, to which they contributed $12 billion in supplies, in anti-aircraft, weapons, tanks, munitions, or grenades, will be decisive for the communists to win the war?
I think it helped, but I think that, as I mentioned earlier, North Vietnam is very, very committed to winning, and they were going to continue that war as long as it took to win. And there's a lot of speculation about how much support they got. There is now new research coming out that support did in fact occur. How much of it helped, I'm not sure that it would have made a difference, but ultimately it didn't matter. We left and they took over Saigon. So I think the reason the North won was more attributed to the fact that they were committed to winning. They've been fighting the Chinese for 1,000 years. They've been fighting others for, they were good fighters, and they were going to keep going as long as it took for us to leave. They were fighting the French forever, and they knew it was just a matter of time before we would get tired and we would leave. They won the strategic messaging. In 1968, we really had them on the ropes after the Tet Offensive, and pretty much the Viet Minh, the Viet Cong were decimated. And that should have marked the end. But what happened was that Walter Cronkite went back, and this is attributed to his news conference where he goes back and says, the war, as after Tet now, it looked like we had been hit hard by this, counterinsurged by this insurgency force, when in fact we decimated them and pretty much should have been the end. He went back and got on TV and said it was a stalemate and there's no end in sight. That really ramped up the anti-war movement. That really energized and made it more difficult. And that's why Nixon ran on the platform to get us out of Vietnam. And that really marked the end, is that when he made a commitment to get us out of Vietnam and turn it over to the Republic of Vietnam military, I think it was the North Vietnamese military's commitment to winning that war that played the most significant role in their victory. Not so much the Soviet and the Chinese contributions, although that helped. You didn't see a whole lot of MiG fighters flying in that war. We pretty much had air superiority. And most of what they had, we were able to address with our strategic bombing. But it didn't matter. It was a ground war, it was an insurgency war, and ultimately they were going to win.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much again for your answers, Colonel Mark Franklin. Now I'm afraid it's farewell time.
Okay.
It's farewell time, sorry. But we hope to see you again soon in another masterclass if you want. And the subject, it can be Vietnam War again or Korean War, or whatever you want.
Very, very good. Well, I enjoyed it, and I really appreciate you giving me this opportunity. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome, sir. You're welcome. It has been a pleasure.
Okay.
It has been a pleasure. So thanks to David, too, for your contribution today. Sorry to our audience, for our viewers, for the technical problems. There were some gremlins inside the internet, maybe. I don't know.
Yes.
And now, remember, please, visiting INISEC's website, that is www.inisec.es, to keep post about our next masterclass and our offer in security and defense. So for today, I have to say bye-bye to everyone. Take care. Thank you very much, sir. Colonel Mark Franklin. Take care. See you again. Bye-bye to everybody. Bye.